Hi, and welcome to Family Sociology Chapter 2, and we're going to be looking at history, culture, and the Canadian families. Now, if you remember in Chapter 1, where we considered what is family, we also reviewed the varying theories to explain the role of family to its members and to society at large. And lastly, we considered the science of family sociology and research methods. In this chapter, we're going to be presenting with an area that's critical to any study of family. Canadian families have changed over time and will continue to change. This is because the family, like all social institutions, is influenced by the larger social context. By discussing the differences head on, we can help counteract the notion that one family configuration is best. The ever-changing mosaic that has defined Canadian society has also defined what is seen as a normal family. Now, many social policies reflect this image, and they may have a negative impact on families that don't meet this standard. In fact, almost all of us belong to a minority group in some sense, whether that's through our ethnicity, religious persuasion, our family compositions, and some other differences. Sensitivity to diversity is important both as we live in our own families, as well as working with other people and their families. In many ways, we're more alike than we are different, and I'm going to say several statements that I'd like you to consider how and if they apply to you. Now, you may want to, make note of the statements that apply to you. Now, here's the list. You own a pet. It's yes or no. Speak at least 3 languages. You play a sport at least once a week. You have a tattoo or a piercing. You have a brother or a sister. You have a stepbrother or a stepsister. You've been to Disney World. You eat rice at least once a week. Blue is your favorite color. You like hip-hop and rap. You like classic rock. You celebrate Easter. You've read the Quran. You live with both your parents. You see a grandparent at least once a month. You have a part-time job. You are a visible minority. Your parents are immigrants. You don't like math. Now, that's an odd list that I expressed, and if you completed that list, you have jotted down those statements that apply to you. And in what ways do you think other people are similar, and in what ways do you think other people are different from you? Chances are not everyone selected the same statements or even had a great deal of overlap from everyone else in the class. You could be very different and you could be very similar, and yet we can still get along and in spite of these sort of differences that exist. Now, thinking about your own family, what is your ethnic or cultural background? In what ways would you say that your family is similar or different from most other Canadian families? Now, there's 2 terms that we're going to begin with. One, the ones that you no doubt have heard of, race and ethnicity. Now, race is a system of classifying people based on physical characteristics such as skin color, whereas ethnicity is a term used to specify a group of people who share a common cultural heritage. Now, while cultures are more real than races, classification by ethnicity is still a complex undertaking, especially in a multicultural society like Canada. Interpreting census data on ethnicity is challenging because, first, the concept of ethnicity is very fluid. Respondents' understanding of their ethnicity, generational cohort, length of time since immigration, and social context at the time of data collection affect reporting from one census to another. There's also an increase in intermarriages among various groups, and that increase in reporting of multiple ancestry. There are changes in the format of census questions that affect our census results. For example, it was only recently included, 2010 I believe, that Canadian was added as a ethnic choice. And this has led to an increase in that particular category. In 1996, for example, it was the first time that people were asked whether they were a member of a population group defined as a visible minority. A person other than Indigenous, or who is non-Caucasian in race and non-white in color, for example. That would include groups that would be Chinese, South Asian, Black, Arab, West Asian, Filipino. So you get an idea that our understanding is difficult. So just as we've seen with the definition of the term family in Chapter 1, there are many different ways to describe groups of people. Legal definitions may differ from social definitions. Individuals may have their own personal definition of their race and their ethnicity identity. In addition, two more terms that sociologists sort of add to better understand the complexity of the relationship between various groups is dominant and minority groups. Minority group refers to any group who holds less power than the dominant group. So it's not about numbers. That's important. A dominant group, that's the group that has the greatest power, but it's not necessarily has the greatest numbers. Now, related to that are two more terms to consider when dialoguing about diversity: prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is a negative attitude. It's your thinking, it's your brain, if you will, towards an entire group of people. Now, this is generally our thoughts and thinking rather than any direct action. Prejudice can lead to actions towards a group of people. Discrimination, on the other hand, is the unfair treatment, the actions of people based on their social characteristics rather than on merit. Now, this can occur at both individual bases or certainly at an institutional level as well. Now, there's direct discrimination, as in your textbook. If a majority member were to deny renting an apartment, say, I have to a family of a visible minority group, that's direct. Indirect discrimination involves social policies and practices that are applied unevenly to different groups. Tuition for post-secondary schools, for example. These are affected by there being white middle-class norms, and it reflects the values of that Canadian British Christian heritage. Now, another term which I'm sure you're familiar with is stereotype. It's the oversimplified perceptions people have out of an entire group. All black people is not different than to say all white people. We're not all alike any more than any other group is. There's too much variability within groups for us to reliably stereotype. So when someone or family moves to Canada from some other country, they are termed an immigrant. Now, once here, some may lack the financial resources, a job or money in particular. Some may have social resources and they're missing, like personal or professional networks. And the cognitive resources, the particular knowledge of a language or cultural norms, become a part of that big picture. And still much of their disadvantage is based on the minority status. There are four main responses to minority status, which are called acculturation strategies. They involve psychological and behavioral changes in the individual as a result of immigration. It starts with, or the first term we'll look at is segregation, then we'll look at assimilation, integration, and marginalization. Acculturalization strategies are located along two dimensions: acceptance to rejection of the new or old culture. Separation, this strategy is based on voluntary rejection of the dominant culture or involuntary exclusion from the dominant culture. Collective versus the individual strategy can occur by choice or be forced on a particular group. Assimilation is based on rejection of heritage culture. It may be voluntary or it could be forced. A form of passing. It's trying to hide membership in a minority group by making one appear like a member of the new culture. An example would be immigrants from India who may opt to choose their own marriage partners instead of agreeing to arranged marriages. The third term, integration, is when high levels of engagement in both the cultures and the heritage are achieved. Most adaptive pathways because it applies a bicultural competence and flexibility. So for example, when hyphenated Canadian, Polish Canadian, Italian Canadian is an example of that. Marginalization, when little possibility or interest in maintaining the heritage and little interest in having relations with others in the dominant culture, it's often associated with the appearance of dysfunctional and deviant behaviors, delinquency, alcohol abuse or substance abuse, family abuse. Aculturalization policies are strategies for integrating or excluding immigrants that are promoted or enforced by a dominant group through laws or other official programs. These processes can include multiculturalism, melting pot, segregation, and exclusion. Multiculturalism policies that accept diversity include all ethnic and cultural groups. And Canada is an example of that. The melting pot, policies that encourage individuals to assimilate into the dominant culture. The US, for example. Segregation, policies based on forced separation from the dominant group. And then exclusion, policies that marginalize immigrants. Okay, that's been part one. And in part two, we're going to review Canadian population, its makeup, and its history. We'll see you in part two.